Avenue Radio. This is Afternoons with Monique, recording live in Seattle, Washington, every Thursday at 1 p.m.
You are tuned in to Afternoons with Monique live on Rainier Avenue Radio. Our host, Monique Actress, is not present right now, waiting on her to appear live with us. She will be interviewing Kathy Hsieh, and Monique is here.
You're using the wrong flyer. This is not about Tomio Moriguchi. Is not going to be on until next week. You're on Rainier Avenue Radio. This is Monique Lee, host of Afternoons with Monique show. Today, I have the pleasure of inviting one of the member of the Asian American community. May is Asian Heritage Month, and we have a lineup of Asian Americans in the community who had brought a lot of contributions into the community. And today I have the pleasure of inviting one of our community members who had contributed greatly in the arts. Kathy Hsieh is an actress, a playwright, a director, a producer, and an artistic, what is this? I want to use the right word, an art administrator in the Asian American community in Seattle and Washington in the last, I would say, over 30 years. So without further ado, I would like to introduce to everyone, Kathy Hsieh.
Hi.
Hi, how are you this afternoon?
Good. So great to see you, Monique.
Likewise. So I had a chance to see you first in theater. Actually, I don't know if you know this. About 2006, 2007, when you were an actress and producer for a show called Sex in Seattle. And at the time, we're both very young, right? I remember your name, and Sharon and I, another friend of yours and producer, as the two main actors and co-producer of the show. And everybody was, I think, was like in their 20s or 30s, very young. And I remember being so impressed with you guys for having put together this fun, apt, and exciting show for the Asian American community. I went to a few shows and I was very impressed. So, I'm so glad to have a chance to have you on Afternoons with Monique today. And I think you were on before with Lori Masakawa a couple months ago on our show. So, let's first talk about how long have you been in the Seattle or the Washington State area? And were you born and raised here? Tell us a little bit about your background, Kathy.
Yeah. Well, I was actually born in Utah when my parents were in grad school. But they moved here for my dad to work at the city of Seattle when I was 2. So Seattle has pretty much been where I've grown up, gone to school, and had the majority of my career has been here in the Seattle area. I grew up actually in the Northgate area, moved to Lake City, and then the University District, and then I kept on moving south. I then moved to North Rainier, and now I'm in Rainier Beach.
Gravitating toward the Asian American community. I'm sitting in Northgate of all places, where you started.
Exactly.
Yeah, so I had a chance to read a little bit about your bio, and I didn't know. So your parents were actually very educated. They came to the U.S. For school and met. Tell us, what did they study? And I know that your dad had studied for a PhD in engineering.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah. So my dad came to the United States to study to get his PhD in engineering, and my mom was studying, getting her master's as a biochemist. And then they produced 2 children who were both in the arts.
Artistic.
So for anyone who doesn't know, a lot of Asian immigrant families, they come here to often get better opportunities for their kids. And so the fact that both my brother and I decided to go into theater is a little bit interesting. But I will have to say my parents are overall very, very supportive. And I think it's because of their own experience. My dad didn't want to be an engineer, but that when he was in Hong Kong growing up, that would seem to be like the most viable job, as to be an engineer. But he loved art, Asian art. So his whole life he collected Asian antiques. And the only way he could afford to buy another piece that he'd like is he'd have to sell the one that he already had. And from doing that, he actually developed a whole clientele of people who want to buy the artwork that he was collecting. And so he ended up starting a store while he had a day job as an engineer. But his store became so successful, his business in terms of Chinese antiques became so successful that he actually ended up quitting his engineering job and probably ended up doing far better, just following his passion. So that was an example of that really inspired me as a young child to like follow your passion and things will actually work out because it's what you really want. My mother, on the other hand, she always wanted to be go into gardening or horticulture. She loves gardening. But her father was like, no, you have to be like a doctor. He wanted everyone to be a doctor.
A viable job.
A doctor. But my mom listened to her dad and she didn't feel she could be a good doctor because she's on the shy side. But she ended up studying biochemistry, and a lot of her work was at the University of Washington Hospital, but doing a lot of the testing on vaccinations and different ways to prevent hay fever and things like that. So a lot of the research and development, but she never ever loved what she did. And every day after work and on the weekend, she'd spend all her time in her garden. And so hers is an example of, it wasn't until after she retired that she finally got to do all the things she loved, which is she's been the ingenue in a lot of Chinese operas locally.
Oh, really?
She is taking dance classes with Li Hongda, dance school in Bellevue, and so many like 20-something-year-olds come to me and say, "Oh my gosh, we are so impressed by your mom. My mom just turned 80, and she is able to do a lot of the dance moves that these 20-year-olds are trying to learn." And so, yeah, it is amazing. And so she taught me by the fact that because she did something her whole life and never followed her passion until after she retired, in many ways, like 50 years of her life could have been doing something that actually brought her joy. And so both of my parents were my true inspirations in really, life is short and you need
follow
to
your passion.
Follow your passions, and it will bring you, I think, much more both success and
joy.
Happiness than doing what you feel like you have to do. Right.
You know, the Joy Club, I cannot have you on without touching on Joy Luck Club, since we're talking about joy. I know that Asian American have not had a lot of roles in Hollywood and in the performance arts. But the Joy Luck Club and recently Crazy Rich Asian have once again brought Asian American actors and production into mainstream consciousness again. Have you seen a whole lot of changes since the last few years? Has Asian American actors had been gaining roles? And, later I want to ask about that journey from, 20 years ago when you didn't have a lot of roles to today. Do we have have you seen progression in a positive way?
There's definitely been progression in a positive way, but it's very recent. I actually, it wasn't actually until Crazy Rich Asians 2 years ago that it really ramped up significantly. We've had like different time periods where all the Asian American people who are in performing always felt like for instance, when Jollett Club came out over 20 years ago,
Right.
22 years ago, I think, it was a huge, like, iconic film about 4 Asian women and their daughters, and then the generations before them. And so everyone thought, oh my gosh, this is it. This is what's finally going to open up the doors in Hollywood. Yeah. And now we'll see much more Asian American representation.
Right.
Great. And the film came out and it did really well. And then nothing.
It kind of slowly died down.
Yeah. And then there have been other like moments where people felt like, oh, maybe this is it. Better Luck Tomorrow was a film about young Asian Americans in high school. It was dark, so it was kind of controversial, but it was the first film. Jollett Club was still pretty much an independent film that did not have a large budget. But Better Luck Tomorrow got picked up by a big distributor, Hollywood distributor. And so it got a lot more play and a lot more movie theaters. So we all thought, oh, maybe this is it. This is what we'll like, and nothing happened after that.
Oh.
So there have been these ups and downs. And then, of course, we've seen in the last 5 years even, where there's been a lot of films where there were characters that were actually written as Asian or Asian American characters, and then they were cast with white people. Or the filmmakers decided to change the plot so that it wasn't about an Asian person anymore, so make it a white person. Right. And we've seen that happen a lot, whitewashing and yellowface. And then we've also seen where, a lot of film, like screenwriters. For instance, a friend of mine who wrote the book Hotel on the Corner of Bitter and Sweet. Jamie, a lot of Hollywood producers were asking him about the rights for that book because it was a top seller. And he was like, sure, I'd love to have a movie done about this because it's about a young Japanese American girl who is in love with a young Chinese American boy during World War II. And of course, her family sent to the concentration camps for Japanese Americans, and his is left behind. So it's a love story that spans a couple of generations. So it's a perfect Hollywood film. But every Hollywood producer that he talked to said that they would only be willing to do it if they changed the Chinese boy to be a white boy. And that's happened to so many playwrights and writers where they were willing to do it at Hollywood, but only if you take out the Asian characters.
Don't we have 20 million Asian Americans in the United States today? I mean, we have a big crowd, big enough to support the movie.
So many. And, Asian cinema is like some of the most popular cinema around the world, right?
Bollywood, K-pop.
Yes. Well, and all the Hong Kong films, but the irony is like even someone as iconic as Bruce Lee could not make a career as an actor here in the United States. He had to go to Asia, to Hong Kong to find his career. And we've seen that happen time and time again. Anna May Wong, when the first iconic Asian American born and raised here in the United States, became a phenomenal silent film star in the 1920s. She could not get cast in big name Hollywood films. White people were cast in those roles. So she finally had to go to Europe. And that's where she became ultra famous. But so we've seen that happen so much. And so even, the bigger name actors in our community can only get to a certain level, and then they don't go beyond that. But what really changed things, who knows why, timing, whatever it was, but Crazy Rich Asians, there was something about that film that just people everywhere were willing to support beyond just Asian Americans.
Right.
And it became, a huge hit everywhere in the world even. And so because of that, all of a sudden, right after that film became such a box office hit, and it was the box office hit, I think, that really hit a lot of people's minds, television and film, all of a sudden, all these producers were like, oh, we need to do more Asian American stuff. We need to do more Asian stuff. And so all of a sudden you've seen a whole bunch of stuff starting to come out in the last year or two that's been focused on the Asian American community. But it took that huge of a hit in order to make that happen. And I jokingly like to say that the show that you're talking about that you first saw Sarah and I in Sex and Seattle, it's an Asian American romantic comedy about 4 Asian American women, and we started that 20 years ago. So the fact that Crazy Rich Asians came along 18 years after we did, I think we were ahead of our time.
Right.
Creating an Asian American romantic comedy that centered Asian Americans as the leading roles.
I remember seeing that production 20 some years ago, I think 23, 24 years ago. Don't date me. But I remember your character, right? It was a very progressive and I think vocal voice. I believe this is the one with the white boyfriend. Was that the one with the white boyfriend?
My character was the one that had a high school sweetheart. She specifically wanted to marry an Asian American person like herself.
Oh, okay.
But there was the Asian American guy's best friend who happens to be white was in love with her. So there was this love triangle that happened. But the cool thing about that show, I think the reason why it resonated with so many audiences, it was always a critical and popular box office success and in theater stage here. And the reason why I think it was so popular was because it had 4 Asian American women, and we were all very different from each other.
Right.
And we were not the model minority. We all had different aspirations, different classes. Some were higher class, some were middle class, and some were actually more economically poor. And we all had different interests in our lives, and we all had different parents. And so it was that diverse representation that was so interesting. Most films, even now, when you see something, it's usually just one culture. It's either like Chinese or Vietnamese or Filipino. And this one, the characters were a diversity of Asian ethnicities.
Right.
And so I think that's what resonated. We also had a lot of immigrants, Asian immigrants who came to see the show because they wanted to learn English and learn the colloquialisms of what it meant to be American as an Asian. And they felt our show, there was nothing on television. So they came to our show because that was the way that they could connect with American culture, Asian American culture in a positive way.
Basically, between the two culture. Now, tell me about what is Mikado?
So the Mikado was one of those examples of yellowface here in Seattle. Mikado is a operetta written by Gilbert and Sullivan that they set in a foreign country's sort of Japanese-esque. And it was done for, they were doing it as a political statement about commentary about how Great Britain at that time, England, where they were writing from, was, but setting in a foreign country to do that. And anyway, in 2014 here in Seattle, a local company did that production. And even though all the characters are written to be Asian, and it has traditionally been done mostly by white people. By the time 2014 rolled around, Asian Americans were tired of having it still just only be cast with white people.
Right.
And so a local news journalist at the Seattle Times actually wrote an op-ed about saying, in this day and age, we got to change this yellow face where you cast white actors to play Asian roles. And her article sparked a whole huge controversy that actually blew up nationally and internationally. We had CNN coverage, NBC coverage, like all these national news efforts about like, how can in this day and age in Seattle, a progressive city like Seattle, still be casting white people in Asian roles? And so I saw that happening, and no one locally was really standing up and like looking at how we can do better. So I actually asked my boss at the city of Seattle if he would let me use some of my time to put together a convening, and then invited the Seattle rep to partner by offering their space. And then I basically curated a wide citywide discussion around race and representation in the arts. And it actually kind of opened the door where a lot of arts and cultural organizations didn't realize that a lot of the things that they had traditionally been doing are so harmful to people of color in general. And so we actually had this huge conversation, and a lot of the arts and culture organizations here started working to become more anti-racist, and that's a lot of the work that I do at my office. And you have to realize this was back in 2014, so 6 years before all of the protests around George Floyd and everything that happened this last year. So what's been amazing is everywhere in the country, a lot of arts and cultural organizations, a lot of nonprofit agencies, government agencies have been now looking at how do we become more anti-racist and do this work. And in Seattle, in our arts community, we had actually started this work 7 years ago. So over this last year, people from all over the country and the world, I just got a call from London, people from all over Canada, all over the United States have been reaching out to me to help them figure out how they can do their work in more anti-racist ways. So it's actually become a whole body of work that I never had thought about doing, but has been so much of my work for the last 2 decades here in Seattle, and has now become work that I've been supporting other communities around the world doing in this last year.
Right. Now, I know that you also went to the UW just like I did, and had a long career. And also you lecture at the UW in the, is it the drama or theater?
School of Drama, yeah.
Yeah, School of Drama for a time, and now outside of your performances, playwright or directing or producing, you also hold a real job at the City of Seattle as what is your title there?
Office of Arts and Culture. My new title, we actually just evolved because of all this work that I've been doing, because so many, like other city departments in the city, as well as other government and arts agencies, like I said, all over the United States and Canada, and like I said, just even recently in London, have reached out to me. We just changed my title to Racial Equity and Grant Making. Strategist is my new title, and so that I can focus even more of my time in really helping people think through like what it means to become more anti-racist, and really the heart of it, because this is the question I get more often than not, it's really about how do we become more human, and see and work with other people in more humane ways. And a lot of the work first starts with developing relationships with the people in the communities that have been most oppressed by systemic racism in our country. So really working with Indigenous communities, Black communities, Asian Pacific Islander American communities, MENA communities, and the Latinx communities, and hearing their voices and what they have the expertise in what is not working, and how do we honor what needs to happen to make our societies more center the well-being of all of our people. Starts with centering the well-being of the people who have had the least access to that. And so it's been really inspiring, all of that. And I never would have thought when I was going to the UW studying speech communication and psychology and drama that this is where my life
you end up. Well, I've read your work. I've known your role in the community for a long time, and you have a very unique position where you are a part of the performing arts world, and you also play a bridge in the cultural dynamic, the conversation on race and diversity. So, you know, what I admire about someone like you is the ability to take risks, because you out there, you are advocating, bridging the gap between the communities, the mainstream and the less vocal community, which is the Asian American community. And with the conversation on Asian hate that is going on in the country, and it's Asian Heritage Month, I thought this is a great opportunity to hear from, you know, different places of the community. You know, your part is the part in performing art to reflect a microcosm of that world at large. So I'm so glad that I can get a chance to hear your voice. But last time you were on my show, you also shared with us, and I said that I have to have Kathy back on because there's so much more in the theater world that I would like to learn and the audience would like to learn. How is that reflecting the Asian American experience and voices, right? So gosh, this conversation should be much longer, but we have about 2 minutes left, maybe 1.5. What can we do, and what can the theater world tell the audience at large? How can we support the art in the Asian American community outside of going to theater and watch the show and support you guys financially? What would you like to see happen with the community, the general mainstream community? What would you wish for from them?
Well, here's the thing, that Asian American and Pacific Islanders, as a whole in our American society, have been really invisible. We've been put on this small minority myth that exists that says that we're all doing okay, and so that's both. A lot of other people of color might look at that as like, oh, you all have it easy because you are the model minority.
Right.
But actually, what it does is it's a different sort of racialization of who we are. We're often used as the buffer between white people and other people of color, so that white people can just point to us and say, oh, Asian Americans are doing well, so therefore we don't need to change any of the laws or anything like that, because it just means that other people of color aren't, working
hard enough. Right.
That's not true at all. Everyone's working hard. Right. And Asian Americans, there are also a lot of us Asian Americans where we need to really look at our positionality and privilege, and are we aligning more with being white, or are we in working solidarity with Black and Indigenous and other communities? And I think especially we'll realize that we're never going to be viewed as white unless we work with other communities of color to change the systems and structures that exist. So for theater, the value that theater has is it gives us a place to be more visible, to share our stories, so that we can all see that we're as human as anyone else, and for us to be a place that inspires people through our hearts and opens our minds. Because once you start seeing people as human, and that's part of why there's been so much anti-hate, is I think so much of the time we've been trying to stay under the radar in a way, because as long as we're able to kind of get by, then why stand up and speak and just be re-traumatized? I think this time and age, we all need to work together with all the communities of color in solidarity and really stand up to change these systems together. And theater can be such a valuable place to do that because it creates visibility for our stories, and it's the diversity of our stories and our strengths together that's actually going to be able to make the change that we need to happen.
Well, that is all the time we have for Afternoons with Monique. Today, I'm so happy to have Kathy Hsieh on Afternoons with Monique, who has been a force in breaking Asian American stereotypes and creating opportunities for people of color on my show. Thank you so much for showing your support in the Asian American community and coming on Afternoons with Monique, Kathy.
Thank you so much for having me, and for all the work that you're doing to create visibility for all of our community.
We gotta keep it, keep going. Gotta keep going. So it is our show. Next week are going to have Shattering the Glass Ceiling featuring speaker Angie Clark. And I have been asked to announce that Thursday at 3:30 today at Garfield, O'Day Boys Basketball Game Friday at 7:30 p.m. is going to be on. So join us either on the field or on the show at 7:30 to watch this game. And it is Asian Heritage Month. So next week, we're going to have Tomio Moriguchi of Wachimaya, former CEO for 30-some years on the show. So come back on and watch us next Thursday at 1 p.m. Have a good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much, Kathy.
Thank you. Say hi to Tomio for me.
I will.
Have
a good afternoon.
Start time.
Bye. Thanks.
When I'm not